ever being early.
I saw your
I was
comment.
early, I have to switch games with you, so it's a good spot.
Josh is on the boat.
Okay.
We're ready, everybody's ready.
Okay. All right, we'll call to order the City of Coos Bay Planning Commission meeting, August 9th, 2022. Can I get a roll call for attendance?
Commissioner Terry,
Here.
Commissioner Marion,
Here.
Commissioner Bird,
Here.
Commissioner Geary.
Here.
Chairman Geary, sorry about that. Commissioner Davis,
Here.
Commissioner Stevens. You don't need.
Okay.
Commissioner Miller.
Here.
All right, thank you.
All right, we've got a couple meeting minutes to adopt. First one is April 12th, and second one is June 14th.
I move that we adopt both minutes.
Second.
Perfect. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
I'll abstain because I wasn't there.
Abstain. Same for me.
Okay.
Well, I bet they're fine.
They are.
You-
Okay, and we'll move on to the public hearing. We'll open the public hearing for the draft 2022 housing needs analysis. Do we have a staff report?
Certainly. Good evening, everyone. This is Carolyn. Thanks for being here this evening. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the draft 2022 housing needs analysis and the accompanying buildable lands inventory that goes with that. As you may recall, we went through this same exercise about a year and a half ago, but for a variety of reasons, we need to update this work. This is a requirement of the state of Oregon, and they graciously funded a grant for us to hire the Council of Governments, for who Jake and Rachel Dorfman work for, to prepare this. Jake and Rachel also worked on the last comprehensive plan and HNA work. Following the work you're going to look at this evening, in September, Jake and Rachel will be back to you and I with some comprehensive plan amendments related to this work. So your work this evening is kind of a good starting point for you to be ready for next month. After you look at this, any comments that you want to share, I will be including in a staff report that I present, or that is presented next week to the City Council. The report will go out tomorrow, and Jake will be presenting this to Council next week, a week from today. A little different time, but in the staff report, I've outlined some fairly key pieces of the housing needs analysis and what Jake has been sharing with you in his presentation. And you also received a copy of the draft document. So with that, I'd like to hand it on to Jake. And if there are questions of me as your local staffer, I'm happy to answer them later, but I'd like to hand it off to Jake now.
Thank you, Carolyn. Jake, can you hear us okay?
Yep, I hear you fine.
Oh.
Sorry, just doing the window dance here
No worries.
to unmute myself. Thanks, Carolyn. Good evening, commissioners. Appreciate the time to present our work to you. I'm going to share my screen and put together a presentation, so bring that up. Is audible on that. People see that?
Perfect, yep.
Okay, excellent. Up big so I can see you. Just take a couple seconds to get my setup here and then we can jump in here. Learn to just make sense to get it all sorted out first. Okay. So, Carol really introduced this adequately, but really what we've done is put together a little bit of, for our conversation today, a background and an overview. We'll go into a little more depth than Carolyn did to describe the pathway to this point, which precedes when we started on this update, because we're working on an update, so we'll give a little bit of background before the work that we did to complete the 2020. Really, the work started in 2019. We're going to go over some of the draft HNA conclusions to present those to the group. And then, obviously, we've prepared to address questions and help guide discussion as the commission sees fit. So, wanted to point out our Housing Advisory Committee. The Advisory Committee actually had quite a bit of overlap from our last Housing Advisory Committee previous process. We have Amy and, Commissioner Geary and Commissioner Stevens, who represent the Plan Commission on the Housing Advisory Committee. This group has been super interactive, very engaging, and provided a lot of help in some of our initial assumptions. And so we've met with them a couple times. This is a general overview of the process. Heretofore, again, this is starting with the kind of reboot on this. So you can see our advisory committee meetings. We did a little bit of a just general revisit of the report to review some of the things that we knew needed changing, and then took the opportunity to review to see what other things we might need to update, kind of essentially as a convenience. It's not every community's convenience to keep their HNA fresh. Let's say a lot of HNAs, a lot of housing needs assessments doesn't take long for them to become aged in some regard, right? Especially with things moving as quickly as they do in our days, in our times. And so it's nice to be able to revisit it. So it should be an opportunity to do that comprehensively. You'll see that we've prepared a few kind of ancillary accompanying analyses, one related to UGB expansion, which we're very university's forecasting program. So it's a program that the state essentially buses and more or less requires for these long-range planning efforts to say, well, what do the demographers say about the future? So we make assumptions about the growth that the community will experience. We essentially extrapolate those same dynamics based on the understanding that we have, largely in a crystal ball sense, right? Again, we're trying to make sense of what we see on the horizon for the future, which is not perfect science at all, but we're trying to utilize what we understand now and extrapolate that going forward. And the same exercise happens. We're trying to say, okay, going forward with this additional population we have, what sort of needs will we have to accommodate this future population? So that's the concept of the housing needs assessment from a needs dynamic in a nutshell. Now, again, there's not always, the result of a housing needs assessment isn't always that you're going to need a tremendous amount of additional land, or sometimes it simply means with your current resources, you need to reimagine sort of how you are looking at your regulatory system, your land use map. So all those things are on the table with an assessment like this. So this is the 2020 study, and this exercise was essentially to revisit. So this concept of revisiting was the theme that we picked up on in our initial steps of the process. This is intended to be more of a graphic than something that you read word for word. This is a sort of infographic, let's call it. These are the components of that housing needs assessment, and so essentially an outline containing context. And what you see in yellow are the things that we identified as needing what we refer to as objective updates. Objective updates would be things like, well, it's 2 years later, so we need to revisit all of those demographic information sources that we had, right? So we need to go back to the census. We need to revisit. It's objective because we're not making anything up. We're going back to the source and we're providing the new numbers, right? What you see in that darker orange, those are things that were more subjective. These are things that have a bit more of a component of, well, we want to revisit the methodology for how we address that before. So that's what you see in orange. We're going to go into detail on what those were. This is just to kind of give you a sense for most of this was just looking at the new numbers. And then some of it was revisiting certain sections of kind of a different methodology approach. So the first and foremost is we needed to revisit the population. It's 2 years later, and it's actually a pretty significant couple of years. The 2 years that we straddled here were the years when the census came out. And so somewhat, maybe not surprisingly, but somewhat ironically, there was actually a reduction in human space population in those 2 years. And it's exclusively because that's when the census comes out, then all of the estimates that Portland State does and all of the estimates that, say, the American Community Survey does, they all sort of recorrect on that census level data, right? Because the census is the complete census. Everything else is extrapolating, estimating, giving a sample of information. So when the census comes back, it becomes this thing that everybody locks back on. So when we did that, it turned out Coos had lower numbers than had been estimated in the past. So that's one of the things we had to adjust. Some of the trends that we revisited just in a couple of years, obviously it was a very interesting time period to revisit any trend. And so in a situation cost burden and home prices rising at the fastest rate in over a decade. This is reinforces and exacerbates existing inequities in housing. There was some note by one of the national resources for national trends about climate change increasing as a concern, posing risks to households across the country. And then one of the calls that was made essentially in this modeling was that though median mortgage rates are higher currently, looking at that 20-year planning period, we assumed a longer-term stabilization of rates. So they may not be what they were before, but we're not assuming that mortgage rates are just, this is the beginning of a completely different mortgage rate dynamic. So that's an assumption, an educated assumption to make. On the local level, some of the trends were continued need for short-term transitional housing. State has been promoting middle-out housing and implementing middle housing policies. So that's something that we take into account. They've been putting money behind it. This project is one example of that. They've been establishing policies throughout the state. So that's something that we need to acknowledge as we look at things on the horizon and trends in real life. A need for single-room occupancies for younger families and older residents wishing to age in place, much lower than expected, and allow development on buildable lands despite needs. So this has been mentioned in the past, but one of the calls went out more explicitly that although we seem to come up with these objective, analytical, quantitative surpluses of buildable land, it doesn't seem that that land is developing. So there's definitely a need to look at, okay, why, despite the need, are we not seeing developments occur that address the housing needs? So one of the things that got incorporated into the 2020 HNA, we were in a very unique position in that at the time that we were preparing that, there was a development that you all are probably familiar with, a large, many-unit, hundreds of units development that had entitlements to have been approved for certain preliminary steps. So we found ourselves in an interesting place where we're trying to capture sort of a cross-section of the housing dynamic in Coos Bay, and we had this thing that was kind of sitting the fence. So it's like it had been approved. It seems that we need to assume that it's going to develop. And so that's important because we're trying to make assumptions about what is available for development and what is development. There's sort of a binary dynamic there. So what you do with something that's been approved but isn't yet housed. And so the call that we made at that time was to essentially presume that those were units. And we made assumptions about how many units, what kind, and as it turned out, that dynamic shifted in the interim. This was one of the key reasons that we wanted to revisit the housing needs assessment, because it actually had a significant influence. And so the decision that is proposed in the housing needs assessment that the Housing Advisory Committee discussed was treating, essentially being less specifically responsive to a specific proposal, to treat the development simply as buildable land, like unbuildable land presently, to assume that it would develop at the same rate that any other vacant land of the same type is going to develop. That is the safer bet because if something changes, we just have a methodology that's consistent throughout the city. And as it turned out, that development's current proposal is in alignment unit-wise with that methodology. So that is to say, so it should be included within those lands. So in a sense, you're looking at slope as a hard constraint where you actually have a functional cutoff within the code that says you're not allowed to develop on lands that are over 20%. So the comprehensive plan and development codes say that. And then a soft constraint, which is really just this kind of practical concept within the community. These developers, even though they can develop on slope, the kind of development that we're looking for, some of these housing types. So what although any of us might enjoy living in one of these homes, it's not exactly the target need that the state has for development. So as you increase those costs and constraints, you really limit the ability to develop the kind of housing that meets kind of the core need that's emerged from the plan here, from the assessment. Here's a map that shows liquefaction. One of the things you'll notice with quite a few of these is that they overlap, right? There's a lot of areas where you have slope, landslide, liquefaction. Those can be related to one another. And then things like wetlands and floodplains are associated with those. So it's not, we're not, adding up all this acreage. It's cumulative. So what we end up with at the end is a number that reflects all of these constraints. Tsunami inundation. One of the things you notice with tsunami inundation is that it impacts actually a lot of already developed lands. So it's really its greatest impact is related to what we call infill development, meaning development on areas that could be more efficiently developed. So the tsunami area impacted the ability to think about areas for redevelopment, for infill. So this is the buildable lands bottom line. I highlight here the environmental constraints because it's the primary difference. If you looked at the whole buildable lands inventory for 2020 and this current one, the constraints is really the primary difference here that you see. And what we end up with is a much smaller figure of buildable lands because of the constraints that have been removed. Because they're not the places where we want to put our eggs in that basket when it comes to housing in the future, and the state provides mechanisms for us to account for that risk and for those constraints. So we end up with a smaller amount of buildable land, right? So going forward, the buildable land is how we accommodate our future population. So the smaller that number gets, the less able you are to accommodate your future population. So this is the map that we end up with in the buildable lands inventory. This characterizes land into different categories. You can see there some of the key ones are vacant and green. Then there's these different categories of vacant with certain plans or with certain nuances. Partially vacant, meaning that they have capacity to accommodate more development. Infill is essentially a variation of that. Then areas that are developed and then areas that are unbuildable. So you can see a pretty sizable amount of unbuildable land within the state. A lot of areas that are just too high to slope or have a designation that is just not, doesn't accept residential or development of any kind. And so this is how we categorize things so that we can make decisions on this structure here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the housing needs assessment component of this, and the key starting place for this is this model. I mentioned that we have to, there's no Wikipedia or Google search or Facebook group or any place where you just go and say, give me this answer for Coos right now. Like, how amazing would that be? It's every scientist, demographer, planners, anybody's dream, right? Is that we can just know what it is. The truth is what we're trying to extrapolate is information from the best sources that we can find. housing model that we put all this information into kind of runs the spectrum from highly objective and predictable information to information that, again, there's no place to go to ask how many homes are worth X objectively, and what sorts of folks live in exactly those homes. So some of that information exists, but just you're trying to connect the dots in a way that makes as much sense as possible. That's what the model gives you the structure to do. So working with the model, we end up putting these, some of these are inputs and some of these are outputs to the model. We're using information for today, for the model is essentially outputting information for the future. Some of those are inputs that we give the model, some of those are work that the model does to tell us the output. At the end of the day, we end up with the total housing units number, 8,176, you can see here, for the future, and that's our future need for housing. So we have to reconcile that number with some of these variables that we've already come up with. We'll revisit some of those figures, but I want to paint some of the housing dynamics picture for you for Coos Bay. So this is an important picture to paint. So this one is, I think, particularly, this tells a story that is the story of so many communities, and I've found the more I've done these studies, the kind of harder it is to delve into these realities, right? So the green bar that you see is renter cost burden. So 95% of folks in the lowest category are cost burden. And that number decreases, but it's still pretty high, even up into the kind of middle class range. These are folks who pay more than 30% of their income to house themselves for housing expenses. And owner dynamics is a little less in some of the categories, but still quite high. This is not unusual. So it paints this picture of cost burden that I think we all have a touch point with. This provides a little bit of a summary of how the housing law will utilize this current housing infrastructure. So the units that exist in Coos Bay and the age and income data. So it tries to line those up. Again, there's no place where you can just directly line those up, but it tries to take the information that's available and extrapolate that. So one of the things you see is not surprising on the lower end of the income spectrum, you have a lot of demand and not much supply. The next category, is kind of anecdotally looking at that is hard. I mean, if you look at the lowest category, there's literally no supply, right? So that should be a stark sort of reality. And then we have kind of in that mid to upper section, there seems to be, at least the way the model is treating the Coos Bay's inventory as this is a match where there should be a place where those in this income category should be able to find housing. And we know that the reality is more challenging than what this graph depicts. Then the same thing for owner households, where it's simply difficult for folks in certain categories to find ownership opportunities. It is sort of interesting on this upper end, the highest end, that there are folks who could afford more cannot find housing at the level that they can afford. So this is all about matching a very quantitative way. If you make this much, you should be able to afford housing at this price. So one of the things that's kind of interesting about this is to imagine that, when we say we need more homes on the higher end, it's not exactly the tip of the spear for housing, but one of the interesting impacts of that is that when you do provide that, then folks who can afford more vacate homes that others can better afford, right? So I could afford a larger home or a bigger home, more expensive home, but this is all I've got. So I've sort of displaced someone who should be in the home I'm in, because this would be more in their price range. Because there's nothing for me, I've had to kind of displace them. So there's a little bit of a ripple effect that happens. And it's why we don't just look at the low end of housing, we down and try to figure out how are we going to come up with a distribution that meets demand. So one of the things that the model ends up spitting out, in our case, as you see, is quite a bit more 3 and 4 and 5 plus units, duplex units, and less single family units. That doesn't necessarily mean that there won't be more single family units coming to Coos Bay, right? The HNA doesn't dictate what developers will ultimately do with land and stuff in certain ways, but it does help guide policy decisions around what the needs are. Somehow compelling or impelling developers to create the housing that is needed. The other thing that really stands out here is the idea that vouchers are a key part of any community's ability to meet its housing needs. So vouchers are those housing assistance, Section 8, right? Something has to be supplementary. So this doesn't account for, essentially, you're looking at units there that you could never find a unit for that price. But the vouchers become the key that fill the gap between the income level and the rent level. So vouchers are a key part of any strategy for housing. So, the models choose on this and spits out some numbers. Ultimately, what we come up with is a need for units in each of these categories. So this is the proposed set of needs. These are the new rental and ownership units that are needed to meet the demands for 2022 to 2042. The total number of units of 543. Our next step then is to reconcile. You see those same numbers. Essentially, translate those numbers into acreage. Say, okay, if there's this many units and there are this many units per acre, these are the number of acres that we need. And then we sum those numbers into the acreage that ultimately we're going to require, right? So our estimated land needs are 45.5 acres. We reconcile those with the amount of acreage that we have available according to our analysis. And what we end up with is no category that has a deficit. So at this point, we have at the highest level really the same outcome as we had in 2020. That even despite the removal of significant environmental constraints, we still end up with the subjective quantitative deficit, the surplus of buildable land in each of these categories. So that's one of the key findings of the HNA. Another key outcome, though, is that we actually have higher numbers based on the analysis that we revised. We have higher just swap out land that is currently in UGB for other lands that better meet urbanization needs. That's about as much depth as I'll go into that. There's some resources that put together that will be in front of you sometime soon. But these are some of the kind of key conclusions from the analysis. And so I welcome questions or concerns, thoughts.
Thanks, Jake. Do you guys have any questions? I've
Well, I kind of do.
been on the committee a couple times, so I feel like I've talked about this a lot.
I kind of do. I mean, I guess I'm just amazed at where some of these numbers might have come from. The first, in the ownership column there, affordable range, basically the first three columns don't exist as far as I'm concerned. I just sold four of the least expensive properties I could imagine, and they're above that. One bedroom, you know, it's just, I just don't believe some of the data. And I guess I'm kind of wondering what we do with this data then, I'm sure this is crystal clear to the rest of my board here, but I guess I'm confused about just what we would do as a city in simple terms to help accommodate any of these issues.
We pair this with the incentives for development. So we're
What
using
incentives?
incentives for private property owners to develop their land.
What are those incentives? I don't have any idea what they are.
System development fees,
That's a small thing.
streamlining the process, I guess. They've been talking about kind of updating their
We
process.
have done that some, yeah.
I don't
Anyway,
know.
that's my thought.
Sure.
Gary? Yeah, this is Carolyn, sorry to interrupt, but I think that's a fair question. What are the incentives? And right after the housing needs analysis work is completed and the other related work to that is completed, we will be back to you with what's called a housing production strategy. We worked on the very beginning of this back at the same time we did the 2020 housing needs analysis. And the city was funded another grant to come up with what's called a housing production strategy that will address that very question, Commissioner Berg, to identify incentives for development. And I hate to put you off, but there's just so much we can throw at you at one time. So rest assured, we will be coming back to you with that work. It will probably be it'll be in the springtime. But we have undertaken quite a few amendments to our development code to really streamline the development review process. And we really felt like that provided some assistance to the building community so that it wouldn't take them as long to get through the system. You might have noticed in this last year, when you have met as a planning commission, you're not hearing projects that you normally would, because those are now being handled often by staff with public review comments to people within 300 feet of the property. So that has been a real help, and so that is one incentive that we believe will be effective, but time will tell. So I just wanted to share that information and just ask you for your patience and to stay tuned. We will be back with more work in the incentive department. Thanks.
I just want to piggyback on that and further validate the commissioner's comment that, when I mentioned earlier, the sort of hair pulling thing, again, one of the things that the law demands is it says, look, you got this many structures, you got this many people, they make this much money, you tell me where they live. So as part of this, and there is this just rub and tension, just reality where it's like nobody can find a home to own for under $100,000. there's this many people in your community that have the same problem, put them somewhere. And so you use the data that you have to do that. And I feel like what it does is it paints a picture more than something that you should look at and try to fully explain it. The model forces you to really wrestle with that. At the end of the day, I feel like it's more a stain that emerges than something that you can take too seriously because there's some subjectivity in trying to get there. So I fully validate the concern. And what we do about it is what I think Carol was trying to create opportunities to address a very genuine need.
I think Josh might have had a question pop up.
Have appropriate amount of local lands wouldn't need to incentivize building on. Yeah, I think it's part of my sort of land exchange concept was this idea of, and it's one of the things we've heard, which was, so for example, there's the area just to the west of downtown, west and south, which is it's not multifamily properties, it's like multifamily. And it has pretty significant slopes. So it's ideal in that it's close to town, that you could sort of master plan it because it has larger lots. But it's maybe not the most attractive dynamic for a developer who's looking to create housing that has affordable options built into it. Again, because anytime you deal with grade, more grade you're dealing with, the more geotech or roads have to be engineered and infrastructure has to be somehow accommodated. It's just expensive, so it's not a perfect fit. So one of the ideas of the kind of land exchange is maybe there's land adjacent to the UGB that could do a better job than the lands that were brought in for X purpose that don't seem to be addressing it. Incentives shouldn't be underestimated. I mean, that's how other communities pull that off, particularly that close to like town and construction. But point taken.
Just a question here on, there's no page numbers, but this current and projected future housing profile identifies total housing units in 2022 and 2042. And the things that sticks out to me shows 668 vacant housing units. Where did that number come from? Because I would challenge somebody to count that many housing units in Coos Bay that are vacant. Just a point.
Yeah, so the rate comes from the census. So we do find ourselves in a position of, sort of the sniff test stuff. So one of the things to consider there is that, just at a higher level is the more we reduce the vacancy rate, the less our need is, right? So there's no question numbers game. The census is what we typically rely on for these numbers. That has a bit of a balance between your rent or vacancy and your owner vacancy. And the vacancy does decrease in the future. But probably not a satisfying answer to the question again, because you've got this. I live in Coos Bay. I looked on Zoom or Zillow, and I can tell you like there's not a ton of vacancies. So vacancies also include obviously the places that are vacant for a range of reasons, not just on the market waiting for someone to come set up a lease or buy a place. That's another part of the answer.
Just an additional comment here. Step back a couple years. I thought that there was going to be an opportunity to see some multifamily housing developed in Coos Bay because rents were trending way up. And that equation, as it relates to cost, is what drives new housing, multifamily in particular. And then along comes COVID and these extreme disruptions in our supply chains, and housing costs have gone up dramatically over the last 2 years because of that. And so now we're out of balance again with regard to new construction, and it's going to take some significant increases in rents to, and possible incentives, wherever they may come from, to entice developers to build multifamily housing at even at the cheapest, less expensive apartments. They're still difficult to build and make profitable. So it affects this type of analysis, these cost increases that we've had. You probably haven't taken that into consideration in this study.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. My pause there for a second was just it's definitely an interesting time. You know, the housing is always predictably, right? That's why people invest in real estate, is because there's a predictable return. There's no question that within the last several decades that has become a harder creature to track predictably. It was very interesting to go through the same model just within 2 years, which historically I think if somebody did this in the 90s, I don't know, maybe depending on when they did it in the 90s, but 2-year period would kind of be like, well, yeah, it's a little bit more expensive. But it is pretty remarkable how things changed just over those 2 years. Related to cost and expense. And, I believe one of the COVID trends that we noted in there, which again, we were trying to be careful. You're making a 20-year plan and you're trying to make sure you don't get too nested into an immediate trend. But certainly the supply chain, the costs, I did an addition on my home and it was just crazy how all of the budgets got turned upside down just within months. And so, yeah, in a short-term sense, I think the housing production strategy definitely
I believe I read in the data, I'm not sure if it was in the study or in this packet, that one of the incentives for multifamily was waiving property taxes for up to 5 years to allow the profits to come in that first 5-year mark, and then property taxes would be due after that. So I thought that was a good.
Good start.
Yeah.
The city did commission with DLC's helping pre-production strategy was laid out in a few of these, which I don't know if, I don't know where that's in the open care, but it does provide a little bit of a hint to some of the things that would be considered going forward.
Absolutely.
I just had a quick question. If you're going to reduce systems development charges, Commissioner Miller, if you're going to reduce systems development charges and you're going to lower taxes and you're going to give out a lot more Section 8 vouchers, where does this money come from? I mean, the water board's gonna need their money for systems development, that's what they operate on. The taxes, your county taxes that you pay, that's what we run the schools and the fire department and the city on. If you're gonna give that away to house people, I guess I'm just having a hard time thinking somebody's gonna pay for this.
Well, it seems to me that the whole tax structure for the United States is a mess because of that. And that's, you know, and if you go to Europe and you look at these big buildings outside of every city, they're all built by the government for people to live in. They're not built for, there's no profit there. And, you know, that's not, we don't understand that here, but eventually we want these people off the street, that's what we're gonna have to do. Because these structures are gonna have to happen. And they're not gonna happen out of the, you know, out of the largesse of capitalism.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we'll own nothing and be happy.
Don't want to scare anybody.
Sorry. Any of the communities we work with, so that this isn't my particular specialty, the programs and incentives, but they're always just a tricky trade-off. I don't think anybody goes into that without carefully thinking through the kind of cost benefit analysis. And I would guess that the expertise behind the production strategy would be, you know, providing advice and recommendations that account for that. This idea that, you know, we're looking at a net positive dynamic. To the other commissioner's point, you know, the crisis is, I think, just being really emphasized as something that has to be addressed in some manner. So I think there's different ideas about trying to accommodate the needs is something that is really at the fore and needs to be addressed. They're just complicated problems. There isn't a community that I know that isn't working hard to try to figure it out, and there are successes and there are kind of stumbling blocks. So I think it's hard to not validate anybody's sort of perspective about it. That's what makes it a challenging issue.
Just a question for Jim. With regard to the city of Coos Bay and the Coos Bay North Bend Water Board, does the city have any ability to work with the water board on system development charges for the water charges for installations, etc.?
I don't know that we have legislative authority, but we do appoint people to the water board from each city, and so that would have to be a conversation. It certainly could be brought up to the water board for consideration.
Of course, the water board's got to come up with the money from somewhere,
Yeah.
and that's the reason they have system development charges.
Right, to
So,
expand
you know,
their
it's
capacity.
There's a complicated structure here that needs to be looked at if you're really going to make big change. I mean, right now, some of the larger buildings that we have that were housing, validated, Section 8 people have changed over to not, to doing that, and to be strictly a for-profit business, which is their business. But the thing is, it's, none of these numbers point to a very good way to find the wherewithal and the incentive for anybody to build that 50-unit complex with the complicated and expensive, requirements that we have. There's no way to build something cheap, and there shouldn't be, but there isn't. And I think that's something that's, hard for people to understand until they're trying to do it.
Right.
Well, you see, what is it, House Bill 6064, I mean, you're seeing policies that are promoting some of those accommodation for your traditionally accessible forms of housing. So your manufactured homes, right? There's the rules that are being deployed that provide for this kind of streamlined approach where this is kind of a reality check for the constraints that folks have. I have a brother who is a professional, college degree, cannot find a place to house his young family, right? I think we all have touch points on this. It's a pretty real problem. And it's very difficult for many of us who have established to go to that next step. That's the other challenge. It's very difficult to take that next step because things have moved so fast that it's a real concern. So
Another question for Jim. The city of Coos Bay has, or doesn't have, systems development charges on a per housing or per unit basis, or do they?
We do not. We have a moratorium that's been in place since like 2006
Yep.
or 8.
So the city of Coos Bay has historically not had SDCs,
That's correct.
and we're still lagging behind in development. And in contrast to Brookings, which has a $25,000 SDCs, Bandon is hitting 15,000 plus. Coos Bay has done a great job of not charging SDCs. So, or really the SDCs are through the water board at this
Right.
point.
That's correct.
Thank you.
I think, Commissioner Marino, there's some unintended consequences of not having the SDCs though as well, because, if there are SDCs in place, there are people that are rehabbing these older vacant homes. How many vacant homes do we have, basically tear down places in Coos Bay right now that are sitting idle that no one's doing anything with? If we had some SDCs in place, people may take advantage of some of these blighted lots and develop those because they don't have to pay the SDCs. I think for every, for most incentives, there's a trade-off, and just Coos County, this region as a whole, I don't know how many tax breaks and incentives we've given to various businesses who have come in here just long enough for those incentives to expire and then take off. We just never seem to come out, I don't think we'll ever come out ahead on all these tax braces and incentives that we've given out for the region. Not just Coos Bay specifically, but that's just kind of my thought on those. to clean up.
I don't know where these blighted neighborhoods are that are, you know, I've seen most of the houses that can be renovated, being renovated. At least that's what experience I've had. Has anybody seen anything much different from that, you know? If there just aren't, I mean, if there's something that hasn't been picked up by somebody that wants to flip it, to fix it, it's just not flippable. And, you know, I mean, there's just not, we just don't have an inventory of neighborhoods that would be great if we just go in and, you know, do some paint and fix it up and put a new roof on it. Doesn't exist here as far as I know. Maybe somebody else has seen a lot more of it than I have. They probably have.
Well, SDCs don't apply to remodels.
Remodels, it's just
I
vacant.
mean, existing housing, they don't apply. Jim, you
But what he's
probably,
saying is that if you had SDCs, that would be the incentive to use a lot that already had a house on it. But whether that, and so that without the SDCs, there's no particular incentive to do that, which is, you know, that's just what he said.
Yeah. The lack of SDCs means that we can't do certain projects that increase capacity. And so if we do need to do those projects, then that means we have to raise our rates. So we spread the cost to those that already live here, as opposed to the SDC, which kind of puts the burden on for
Existing.
expanding on those people that are moving into our community. But there's trade-offs.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think the cities should increase SDCs. I think that's a disincentive for new construction. And that's a big deal.
I think this analysis shows that there's need across the board. And so if we could tackle, I know we're not going to be able to tackle it all, but if we could tackle some of it, it would relieve the pressure on other areas. Just like he was mentioning, higher price ranges, people are buying lower price range houses because they can't find something that they want in their range. Same thing happens with rentals. If people can't find a rental, they end up buying instead of renting. So if we could try to find the ones that we can make changes to I don't want to call it an incentive, but just make changes to those ranges, maybe we could alleviate some of the pressure on some of the other areas. Because there's need across the board. And of course, we need multifamilies.
Is there anything we're supposed to do today?
I'm sorry?
Any motions we're supposed to make today, or decisions?
Mr. Hosley's up again.
Carolyn reminded me that we need to make sure we open up the public hearing.
What's that?
We need to make sure we open up the public hearing.
Okay. Any more questions for Jake from the commission? Okay, we'll open the public hearing.
Good evening, Jim Barron's, Fulton Street, Coos Bay. As you guys read this, you looked at page 7 of 57 and went 8.8% vacancy rate right this instant. And field studies, and they were done last summer, was less than 2. A very small sample was done this spring. It was less than 2. The actual vacancy rate for housing in this community is less than 2%. And LCOG needs to either do a field study and go look and come up with a better number. I think what he was trying to explain, that he needed an 8 number to make his machine crank out, his model crank out other data points, but we'll pass on that for now. Constraints. Constraints are understated. We lost 200 acres of land off of one to another in 2 years. We really have lost more than that. More than that is not in the inventory. And the reason for that is it doesn't pencil out to build. Jeff sits over here, looks at a piece of dirt and says he wants to put 15 units in. Then he figures the engineering out. Then he figures the backfill out. Then he starts ordering concrete blocks to do the wall, all right? And then he starts to build it, and pretty soon there isn't a dime in it. He can't make any money. As a renter operator, he might be able to turn them into condos with a few, but we need to look at a switch. We need to look at this constraint, okay, that this 200 acres that quickly disappeared in just 2 years in buildable land, and get our urban growth boundary changed to get out and fire and maneuver. Find us some bigger pieces of dirt that people can do something with. Not people that are going to file plans and goof around, but people that will actually do something. That 400 units on Lindy Lane, that's what, the 6th time somebody's tried to build something there? Maybe the 7th? I think 6. I don't know if it's all the same guy because I can't track all the corporations. All right? But we need to look at expanding the urban growth boundary. And we need to do that because our constraints, even with taking 200 some acres out, are still understated in this report. All right? And I know I might upset some of you guys, and I'm going to anyhow. All right? Stream set-asides aren't properly documented here. There are stream set-asides, like on First Creek. There's not near enough of the First Creek watershed protected. And Coquille's made an effort at it, the tribe, all right? But as you look, as things change here and everyone gets more concerned about the bay, they're not going to let you run a culvert into the bay anywhere. And they're going to make you take all these culverts that you have running into the bay that don't go through a swale and don't go through a holding pond. They're going to make you stop that because it screws up the bay. And that's not in any of those charts, but it's gonna happen. It's an absolute given, okay? No matter who's in power. If you want fish, you have to control the salinity in that bay. That means you have to control your runoff. So it's gonna happen that the constraints are gonna expand. So my personal opinion is that's a very lovely model they used. They use a lot of black arts and hocus pocus. They don't want to tell you what they're using, and there's a reason for that. Then you'll go out and do stuff to make things work out in your favor. They want an even playing field, so they have some things they don't quite tell you about. It's called the black arts. So, and the bottom line to this is it's kind of good numbers. I saw references to the 2010 census in here, so not everything is 2020. When I read it, I saw references to the projections off the 2010 census. So you're 10 years old plus the computer model, which is probably a little haywire. But my personal concern is an expansion of the urban growth boundary to get somebody that has enough land that doesn't have slopes and doesn't have a lot of wetlands, or has enough land that he can mitigate wetlands and swales, okay, and we can actually get something built. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you have public comment as well?
My name is Gary Colvin. I live on Inlet Loop in Pacific Crest. I'm the Vice President of Pacific Crest HOA. And Mr. Burns was afraid that he was going to upset you. I'm sure that what I'm about to say is probably going to be even more so. Over the last 3 weeks, I have listened in, unfortunately remotely, because I've been out of state, on 2 separate city council meetings in which they repeatedly discussed things that apparently came or started off in the Planning Commission. They certainly referenced you quite a bit as the basis for things. Specifically regarding HB 2001 and HB 2003 that seemed to be waived heavily, they claim the fact that those sections, that code, the House bill, requires that Coos do duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, and townhouses in small lot residential areas. It does not say that, does not require that. We have a population between 10 and 25,000. We're classified as a middle-sized city under the ordinance, under the bill. Duplexes. Only duplexes. That's the only thing that it talks to. Streamlining the process was also discussed. Oh, we got to streamline the process for building these duplexes, these multi-tenant buildings. No. It says that the same process that you use for single-family homes is to be applied to those. No difference. It says it right in the language. Another big one, and as I look up here, it was also represented, not only at the last meeting of the City Council, the one before that, that they're going to build 200 townhouses on the adjacent parcel to Pacific Crest. Not going to happen. That's deed restricted property, belongs to the HOA. We have extensive easements on that property. We have sent demand letters or notifications from our attorney to the current owners. We are just notified who the new owner is. Correspondence went out to them as well. Not going to happen. Where somebody came up and said that they're going to build 200 townhomes on that 32-acre property, and that's what you're betting on, not a chance. We had 3 separate representatives at the board meeting, at the city council meeting last week. All said the same thing. Lawsuit, litigation. Have absolutely no idea where that information came from, but they pointed to this body right here. So I just want to make sure that I set the record straight. That land, that 32 acres that is attached to, that's adjacent to Pacific Crest subdivision, is deed restricted property. We control it. One house, RCC and RC, one single family house per lot. To subdivide that requires a supermajority. That's 75% of the current homeowners, which are 34. Never going to get it. What you really need to do is concentrate on that 400, as Mr. Barron said, the 400 units that you've already approved for Timber Cove. Figure out a way. I love your idea of extending the urban boundaries. I think that's absolutely brilliant because it then opens you up to get a lot of federal money. Thank you.
Thank you. This is the first I'm hearing about the townhomes.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Carolyn, yeah, I have no idea. Could
So-
you fill us in?
This goes back probably 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago when the Planning Commission heard a proposed development by Westbrook on that 32 acres, which is to the south of that
Pacific Crest, yeah.
particular piece of property. So that project, maybe it was a decade ago, was approved way back then, and the economy crashed after that. But those permits, those applications have long since dissolved and are not applicable. The Planning Commission hasn't heard anything about any new developments
No.
that I'm aware of since then.
Not in the last number of years.
So we haven't decided about anything on that 32-acre piece for 12 years.
So we're not upset.
We brought 15 people from our community to the meeting on last Tuesday because of that, because of the announcement from the city council the week before. I believe it was Benetti himself who made that announcement. It's all the city manager, excuse me.
That's a different organization.
Yeah, went to the wrong meeting.
Yeah.
Madam Chair, I'd like to extend my remarks just a little bit, okay? I'm sorry, guys,
That's okay.
I hate coming down here, I really do. You may not believe it, but it's not my favorite.
You're the best.
If you look through this thing about, it's 50-some pages, and it's projections and models and stuff, we're counting a 100-year floodplain at about 50% occupancy. About 50% of it's subtracted off, and that 200 they took out of the inventory should be 100% unoccupied. That 100-year floodplain, and anybody that travels down the south, 9th Ward, Louisiana area, places down in Florida, those places don't get rebuilt. And when they do get rebuilt, they don't even have the density that they had because the lots go foreclosure. Ninth Ward's maybe a third rebuilt at the best, and it got flooded, and that was a 100-year flood. So counting tsunami inundation zone, I kind of vacillate on that a little bit, but counting 100-year flood stuff as available in our inventory, no, it's not, because if you tried to build now, you'd never be able to do it. It wouldn't pencil out. You'd be jacking houses up like Mapleton. All right, it isn't going to happen. So we've got stuff in here that needs to come out of this inventory. All right, it just doesn't pencil out. Okay, it didn't pencil out 10 years ago, and now with the higher building materials and the cost of everything going up, it still doesn't pencil out. We need bare buildable land. We don't have it. We have land with constraints. Yes.
I have a quick question. If you were to extend the urban boundary, where would you go? We got hills this way, we got bays that way.
You
Where would you go?
own up to Libby, belongs in the city, and figure out where you want to go. Try to find something, okay? You need to think out of the box, guys. We're boxed in. We really are. We're topography boxed in, but we're not totally boxed in. We really have to look at what this community is going to look like in 25 years.
Well, mostly our urban growth boundary is the same as the city limits, isn't it?
Yes.
Right.
Which
Currently.
doesn't make much sense. I mean, that's not what an urban growth boundary is
Well,
supposed to be.
the only plus I saw out of this whole document was it's an opportunity to perhaps explore expanding the urban growth boundary. That's the only plus I saw out of it. The numbers, the numbers are the numbers. It's a computer model. Some of it's pretty valid. Some of it we all know is just where'd that come from? So
And the
I'll
length
leave
of
that
time
alone.
to take it into the urban growth boundary, that's a constraint. I mean, I have a client that has 400 acres at the edge of Coos Bay, but it's a big deal to get that into the urban growth boundary. And years and cost, and maybe that's where some of the incentive needs to happen. But even so, it's still gonna cost what it costs to build a house there, and that's still a big deal.
Commissioners, this is Carolyn. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think some points have been raised that I'd like Jake to address. LCOG is a very technically astute and highly respected planning arm of the planning world in Oregon, and they took this apart very carefully with the assistance of an advisory committee with a lot of expertise. As a result of that, there was a lot of information developed that maybe you're not necessarily seeing here tonight, but you will be in the future, that I'd like Jake to be able to touch on. So Jake, would you mind? Sharon, Gary, is that okay?
Yes.
Sure, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, and, the comments, I appreciate the comments and the observations on this. In a manner, we're on the same page when it comes to the constraints of these, because, as the gentleman noted, we've increased the constraints significantly. One of the things I wanted to point out, and maybe one other point to circle back to, but the memo that we just wrote, which I don't believe is in front of you, but will be in front of you at some point, is essentially a follow-on to this idea that was sort of alluded to in the housing needs assessment, where we point out the idea of land exchange as one mechanism for, it's a little bit of a, let's call it an easy but option where certain dynamics exist, and we don't do a exhaustive analysis, but we present what looks like an opportunity to kind of look into that option further, where, again, this idea of you have urbanizable, you have area in your UGB, which the principle, generally speaking, is that this is where we focus consultation with the LCD was making it very, very clear that some communities think, well, that they can sort of have a make-a-wish expansion, right? Which is, well, this is where we think everything would be perfect. And in an instance where the state's very specific priorities, they have statutory priorities for bringing land into the UGB. And so, you know, you begin with areas that a lot of communities refer to as exception lands, meaning that they currently are in the county and they take an exception to farm and forest goals. And they have sort of urban-like densities. And so you're required to look at those lands first, and then you're required to look at lands that are marginal, and then you're required to look at lands that don't have certain soil types, lands that don't have certain farm or forest use. So it's a very prescriptive process. So I just want to add that lens that I alluded to this idea of looking outside of the UGB, but I wouldn't want this group to think that that's, and someone did allude to it at the very end there, this is a process that is very prescribed. It's extensive, want to have your story together, but something that I ultimately, in my assessment as one perspective on this, think should be looked at further. So the other thing I wanted to circle back on was the vacancy factor. You know, when we do these studies, if you look at a lot of statute and Oregon administrative rules, there are safe harbors that are in place. Safe harbors essentially are assumptions that you can make that give you safe harbor through the analysis process. So they say, look, we understand that it can be prohibitively expensive to do exhaustive studies about everything. So if you assume a sort of conservative approach to some analysis step that will give you safe harbor through the process, meaning if it gets challenged, it's fine. The idea of census numbers as a vacancy rate, I'm not sure I would consider that an official safe harbor, but it's something that, right, we tend to rely on census, and anybody who's worked with census knows that census is not a perfect data set. The margins can be pretty incredible, and if an exhaustive study was done on a certain dynamic, it's probable or possible that could be revealed in a different light. If we were to change, for example, we changed the vacancy rate to 2%, let's say we found really incredible one of these studies and we wanted to go all in and tell the LCD we want to use this number. We're very adamant about it. What happens is your future population has that many more units to occupy, and all of your numbers go down. And so you're in a position at some point where you're trying to create an opportunity to make a certain case to the LCD. So I guess you figure out exactly how it is, the angle that you want to take as a community, as a decision-making body in the direction of the public, to figure out how it is you want to lean in on those figures. That's something that we can work through. I wouldn't lose sleep over that. The message that I've heard consistently from the community is we're not getting development, and we seem to consistently show buildable lands that aren't buildable. If we go from our census vacancy number to advocating for a lower rate, just for the sake of better conveying what's exactly on the ground right now, I guess depending on what perspective you have about the needs of the community, you really turn the knob down for an indication of need. So that was the other point. Let's see, there was another one which has escaped me at this point, but
I have a quick question for you. The floodplain properties, I thought we,
that was it. That was the other one.
okay, because I thought we removed all of them.
No. So
is it really 50%?
The nuance with the floodplain is that, if we were to say in the study, right, the DLCD is gonna push back, which if the city wants to pursue this approach, then that's fine. If we said in our report, we are removing all floodplain lands, then the city really has to back that up with a policy. If you're establishing an outright prohibition on development in the floodplain, then the city really has to rise to that policy. They'll allow something like 50% because the state recognizes that, yeah, you haven't prohibited, so it could happen in some areas. Developers, people with financial interest in a property probably aren't going to develop in areas that are particularly vulnerable to flood. But by instituting a 50% constraint, you haven't presented an outright constraint, which really would have to have the backing of local regulation. And so the 50% becomes an opportunity to acknowledge that we're not going to see development on all these floodplain properties, but we're also not prohibiting. So it's a little bit of a hybrid kind of trade-off. And so, boy, we were leaning into this. We really were. I mean, I hope that those folks looking that over recognize the clear message that, wow, they really turned the dial on these constraints. We were trying to create a better depiction of genuine constraints, and it's probably possible we could lean in more, but I think the city would have to get behind that in a real sense, right? Where suddenly people have property now have a restriction. I mean, that'd be a big deal. Like Measure 56 kind of stuff that says, yeah, you can't use your property way 5. Because they don't want just the sort of token restrictions, right? Where, well, when the HNA said they wouldn't, but you actually can.
Jake, this is Carolyn. Could you talk a little bit about how many of these lands, they're very constricted, but they're not totally undevelopable if you can mitigate some of the impacts of the development? I remember we talked about that quite a bit related to property on steep slopes and how there are ways to develop it, but it is very expensive. So outright prohibiting development on those slopes didn't really make any sense because you could still do it. It was just very costly.
Yeah, we tried to develop and actually pitch to DLCD a concept around cost constraint. So you have these outright constraints in certain areas that we were trying to tease out the kind of this more nuanced dynamic, which was cost constraint being just a more targeted constraint, meaning, yeah, okay, certain development could occur here, but it's not the development that is our primary need or our primary target. So to your point, yeah, there's where the desire is sufficient. I mean, you don't have to go far in almost any community with slopes to find a place that just baffles the mind about how they figured that out. Somebody wanted a view and had the means to do the geotech and to, provide a space. So it does have implications to drop the hammer completely, and so it's walking that kind of fine line and then doing something that would pass the sniff test with DLCD about what you're saying in your needs assessment, what exists in your regulatory dynamic.
Right. And I think we also talked to the advisory committee about this same issue relative to the floodplain. And Mr. Barron's reference Mapleton and, having to have your house up on stilts. Well, somebody's found a way to do it. It's certainly not desirable. It's not the best, but there are ways to mitigate in some areas of the floodplain. So,
Are we able to tweak those numbers at all? Because, in my mind, floodplain should be at least 80-20. versus 50/50?
I think I just had that thought, and I think it's an interesting question. Might be something to bring our DLCD representative in to see if there's some, if you are genuinely allowing for the actualization of something. I don't know what their tipping point might be there. The 50% is maybe too inconsiderate of the nuance.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't, sometimes DLCD isn't too open to getting too nuanced. So I guess a question that we could pose and consider, the other thought I had was, I wish I just could have it already, would be like how many, let's say we did constrain completely, I wonder if this group would be compelled by the numbers or not. I don't know. Because again, the floodplain, if you look at the floodplain, it's not unlike the tsunami that there's a lot of development there already. So you're mostly talking about kind of scraps that exist. But this is kind of from memories. The floodplain probably more extensive and does have some genuinely developed land there. I'd be super interested just to see the numbers. Like if we all looked at what the number was, would we kind of shrug our shoulders or would it seem compelling?
Yeah, because it's not only the constraint, I know with floodplain properties that are already built, it's the flood insurance, people won't buy them. So I mean, even if, I just don't know that those would be looked at for development in our area.
Well, what about?
Is there commission, maybe the commission could talk about this a little bit, because with the council meeting on this next week, I'm going to be preparing the staff report, actually after your meeting tonight, to send on to them with any recommendations that we may have. And if there is consensus on the part of the commission on this, I can pass it along to the council that you are recommending that we get some clarity on DLCD on how much development, whether it be half and half or 80-20, can be considered as possible in constrained lands, being, flood, slopes, liquefaction, etc. Is that something the commission would be interested in having us follow up on and letting the council know that we're doing that?
Yeah, I think it's ideal to get these numbers as close as we can to the appropriate spot.
A good example of floodplain is Good Pasture Island in Eugene. They said that couldn't be developed, and yet they developed it. They just simply put the houses up so the walls, the water floods through it. You just don't park downstairs when the flood comes. I mean, it's a big development, and that was for years said, oh no, that can't be developed.
Well, all these buildings in South Coos Bay are built up so that they're above the flood banks and.
Yeah, no, I think they can definitely be developed. I come from an area where stilt houses are a huge thing because we're on lakes, but I just think for the study's purpose, getting our actual buildable lands inventory as close as can be would be ideal.
Well, we can certainly follow up on that, and we can let the council know that this is a concern that the commission, you'd like to recommend that we spend some more time on it. The council will look at this after next week. They'll look at it again in October, so we have a little bit of time.
Okay.
And I just wanted to add one other little nuance that I think is useful as context for this particular.
Oh, I think we lost you. Are you?
Is Ms. Johnson there?
Joseph's still on.
Should we just move on?
Are we able to close the public hearing and then just discuss amongst ourselves
Yeah, I think so.
without them?
Yes, you can close the public hearing, I believe, and then just give your recommendation on what to do with the H&A. We'll take the notes and pass that on to Carolyn.
Perfect. Oh, looks like they're, All right, we're going to close the public hearing. And
They can hear us. I'm sorry.
what's that?
I'm sorry to interrupt. They can hear us.
Oh, okay. Discussion amongst ourselves, commissioners? I'd like to see the vacancy rate come down a little bit too.
Well, I think the interest was in addressing the floodplain. I'm not sure how we can address the vacancy issue.
Well, the city's website has it at 7% vacancy rate. I don't know what their source is, but
That sounds more reasonable.
I just can't, I couldn't imagine it at yeah.
Well, what just difference does it make anyway? I mean, you know, we know that it's low, it's probably more like 2%.
Right.
And so,
I do like that they did bring the buildable acreage down. I mean, it was 400 and something in the last study.
To me, the vacancy rate, it doesn't even, it's almost like an imaginary number that they need for their model and not based in reality to get the end goal saying that you need more units. And it's the way it was described to me, and again, I don't have any familiarity with this model, but it's like you have to show the demand in order to justify an increase in supply. Rather than trying to stick with reality, which I think is what Mr. Berg and Mr. Marino were doing. And maybe that's just not the way the government operates, sticking to reality.
It doesn't go on the computer very well.
Make everything work.
nobody's ever hired me to do one of these studies.
Well, we welcome you into the advisory committee.
Well, let's,
Hey, Amy, can you hear me there?
I can.
Why are we redoing this study so soon after we just did this study?
I kept on hearing that
This
they
is
got a
Carol.
grant.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
You can hear me? This is Carolyn.
Yes.
Okay, terrific. There were some things that happened after this study, the last study was completed. Most specifically, there had been a 400-unit manufactured home park authorized at the time the 2020 eval was happening. And we took that into consideration to determine what the future needs was going to be based on an assumption that much of that would be developed. Following the completion of that update, the developer changed directions totally and came up with an entirely new work product that they wanted to present. So they've been issued an authorization to proceed with something else, and that authorization, though, they had to give up their entitlement to those 400 manufactured homes. So that left our 2020 HNA fairly gutted, I guess is the word. So it was important that we take another relook.
Hearing no further discussion, does anyone have any recommendation to council?
What you said. I mean, about the revising the numbers for units in the floodplain, or taking another look at it at least.
Right. Also, I guess, should we consider expanding the urban growth boundary?
I think that's definitely something to look into. And
Yeah, if we could have some options to look at which pieces.
Barview.
Yeah. Do I hear a motion? Anyone want to?
So we're gonna make a motion
Preface?
we're gonna make a motion to do two things to pass on to city council. We're going to, the first would be the floodplain, and the second would be the urban growth boundary. That's the motion.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Jake. Any commissioner comments or staff comments?
I have a comment.
Okay,
Yes, at your next meeting, we will be bringing back to you some comprehensive plan amendments that are related to this work that you're looking at now. And we can also bring back to you the draft urban growth boundary memo that was, expansion memo that was also one of the work products that the city contracted with LCOG to create. So please stay tuned to that. For your meeting on September 13th, we'll be getting everything out to you a week early on September 6th. And I think getting that information will be helpful in some of the things that you talked about tonight. That's all I have.
perfect, thank you. All right, hearing no further comments, meeting adjourned.